Oh boy, another week, another chapter. This was an intense chapter, and I can't wait to get into it. But first, one thing I want to address about a certain type of comment I've seen semi-consistently, which is the Troupe has already been humanized to a degree before the Black Whale arc. And if you don't care about this, I'll put the time to skip to get right into the chapter review, but I want to talk about this for a second. I plan to reread through the York New City arc, so I guess my opinion could change on this. But through York New, Greed Island, and the Chimera Ant arc, there was not one drop of what I'd consider humanization of the Troupe. To use vocabulary.com for a definition of humanizing a character, to humanize is to make things more humane and easier for humans to relate to and appreciate. For an example, a biography of a murderer could humanize the murderer if it showed he had a terrible life growing up. And I think something very important that definition doesn't say is that just because you see someone is human, it doesn't mean that they're humanized. Just because you see someone is human does not mean that you can relate to them or feel for them. I think the main argument for the spiders already being humanized is that we see them do things such as grieve Uvagin's death, Pakunoda sacrificing herself, and the Troupe tirelessly finding a way to exorcise the curse put on Chrollo. Oh yeah, and also going to fight the Chimera Ants because they posed a threat to Meteor City. However, those things just show that they are human. It doesn't humanize them. With the lens we see them through for the majority of Hunter x Hunter, that being essentially the lens of Kurapika and how he views them, we may have seen the Troupe do things that humans would, but at the end of the day, you could only relate to them on an incredibly shallow level. There's nothing there truly humanizing them. I'm about to give a very extreme example, not because it's the same thing of what I'm talking about with the spiders, but just to make my point very clear. If you were to see a story or a movie or whatever about German soldiers in World War II, you could see these soldiers grieve for their fallen comrades. You could see them sacrifice themselves, be brave for one another. But seeing these very real, true human emotions does not and likely cannot purely humanize someone from just those things. To get to my point about the spiders, them showing emotions, kindness, and love, seeing them grieve, seeing them sad and angry, none of these things humanize them. Pakunoda sacrificing herself, the spiders going to fight the Chimera Ants because they posed a threat to Meteor City. These things certainly show that the spiders are human. They show that they have emotions, but it does not humanize them. None of these things allow you to relate to or to feel for them on a deep level. Maybe shallow, but not on a deep level. None of these things should have, at least, ever posed the question of, can you forgive them for all the terrible things they did? And that's kind of the big thing I'm focusing on. With the flashback of the spiders as children, and especially after this chapter, I think there's a very real way to feel for these kids, to feel for the Troupe on a very deep, almost personal level. And you could just not do this to the same extent previously. It also raises the question of whether you can forgive them for all the terrible things they've done because of the terrible things they've went through. It's that humanizes the spiders. It's this flashback that humanizes them, that raises all of these questions, that allows you to feel for them, to feel with them. It's this flashback that humanizes the spiders, and to say it happened earlier, in my opinion, makes Hunter x Hunter appear to be a much more simplistic, basic, more shallow story than it really is. And one more way to kind of defend my point, regardless of whatever scenario it is that could be used to say that the Phantom Troupe has already been humanized, that was still told to us in the lens that they are criminals, that they're a violent troupe of marauders or whatever. But now, with this flashback, we have a whole new lens for them. We see them as innocent kids who love each other and have come together for the most pure, innocent reasons. And it's because of this that they are able to be humanized. I'm gonna leave it there. I feel very strongly about that point for now. I am going to reread the York New City arc. I'm also gonna reread pretty much every time the Phantom Troupe is in Hunter x Hunter, and I will then make a whole video about the humanization of the Troupe. So my opinion could change, but for now, I feel strongly about it. Alrighty, with all that said, we can finally get into this week's chapter, and oh boy, a lot to get into. So we pick up just a little bit after where last chapter ended, and another showing of cleanup rangers is about to happen, but in a separate room, the spiders are together and they're worried about Sarasa because she hasn't showed up. They say how it's not like her to be late, and in fact, she's usually 15 minutes early. And Chrollo looks at the audience worried, but not worried that they won't be able to start. He's worried because he knows that if she hasn't returned, something awful has happened. The spiders end up going to some women who are called Sarasa's nannies. The spiders ask if they've seen Sarasa, and they say they assumed that Sarasa was with them. And we see Finks and Phaeton worried because they too are realizing the seriousness of the situation. The spiders get back to the auditorium and the audience is told to wait just a bit longer. Finks is getting really worried, just showing once again that he's a softie deep down, just like Sarasa said. Finks shares how he's really worried because Sarasa hasn't returned to the village ever since she left, and he shares how she's out somewhere all alone. Ilvo says that she must have gone out looking for videotapes, but then everyone turns to Chrollo, and Paku asks him what are they gonna do. And there's some stuff to look at here. I love how Togashi is always able to really sell emotion through his writing and drawing. I think it's easy to feel and understand the level of concern everyone has. And just the thought of Sarasa, but also just the thought of a kid missing, is something that hurts to read. I also really love how even though everyone has always protected and looked out for Chrollo, he's still the one they always turn to. I think it's really interesting that even though they all protect Chrollo, and at least say he's always in need of protection, I can't think of the right word because interesting and cool aren't quite the right word, but I think it's interesting that how this event has caused everyone to look for someone to lead them, and I like how they all know the one to lead them is Chrollo. And I don't find it interesting because this is out of the blue or something I didn't see coming. It's more the evolution and the fluidity of their dynamic. I've been saying that Chrollo sees the Troupe as his brothers and sisters, and that's still true to an extent, certainly. But with this moment, it felt very much that Chrollo kind of evolves to be almost the mother of the spiders, and I shall explain further. In very basic terms, for the sake of this scene, a mother is often someone whose children and others want to and actively protect. However, in times of stress or in times of need, a mother's children will always turn to her in need of guidance. And that's how this scene felt to me. It didn't feel like the spiders were looking at Chrollo like he were purely just a leader, nor do I think they saw him as a friend, father, or sibling figure. To me, they were seeking reassurance, leadership, guidance, and security, the things someone often seeks in their mother. You could also make the same argument for like a father figure, but just how gentle and pure and emotional the scene was, the thought of a mother felt more right to me than a father. Of course, this is completely up to interpretation, but I think seeing it this way, that being in terms of their dynamic, Chrollo filling a role of sort of a mother, parent, guardian, and leader makes the most sense to me. I think that in general, the spiders' relationships and dynamics are pretty fluid. The only for sure consistent thing is that the core members are family, not just friends or a team. I think that you could see Shalnark's death hitting Chrollo as either a death of a brother or child, or just sum it up to be a loss of a family member. So in short, I feel like in this moment, Chrollo was kind of forced to evolve his role in the group into one of a guardian, parental, mother-like figure. But as long as you agree that the spider's dynamic is one of family, then it's not too big of a deal how you personally see it. Chrollo then gets on the stage and the crowd cheers, excited for the show to start. Chrollo then gets on the mic and thanks so many people for showing up, but he says that unfortunately the show will be postponed. He goes on to say that Sarasa has been missing since yesterday. She was supposed to come back to her village but never showed up. And the audience's faces immediately go blank. And I'd really like to focus on the difference in expression from when they were told the show is postponed and then when they were told Sarasa was missing. The difference is important because it just shows very simply and visually that yes, these kids are worried, but they're not surprised. It's clear, and you can really feel how these kids' hearts dropped to their stomach but they still weren't surprised. I just wanted to point out how well Togashi is able to convey emotion, feelings, and thoughts just off his sometimes semi-simple art style. And just super quick, I don't think it's actually simple. I just think he only adds detail when it's needed. These kids' reactions were able to say so much without needing hyper-detailed drawing, which I think is very impressive. Chrollo goes on to say how they all know child abductions have been increasing, and Chrollo says he takes the blame and he's responsible because he let her walk home alone, without considering the possible dangers. Just real quick, this is why I said the dynamic of the spiders is fluid, but also up for interpretation, because here, he's talking an awful lot like a big brother. And just overall, to me, Chrollo and the others' roles and their dynamics changes depending on the situation, so it's all really fluid once again. But anyway, Chrollo goes on to say that he's gonna go out and look for Sarasa, and that's why the show must be postponed. And the audience starts standing up, saying that they want to help. Chrollo says it's too dangerous, but before he can really finish, Uvo interrupts and says everyone in the village will help look for Sarasa. And all the kids band together and cheer that they're gonna find her. Figs tells Chrollo to go with Uvo and gives them the keys to his bike. Uvo tells Chrollo to stop crying and that they're gonna find her. And he says she's probably just hurt somewhere and got stuck. Chrollo is crying but says shakily, "Yeah, you're right." We then see Chrollo and Uvo on the bike riding around looking for Sarasa. We also see what looks like Chrollo looking at some kind of map. And here it's time to stop and look at some things. First one is once again, we see very clearly that the dynamic of the spiders is fluid. Chrollo went from being what I interpreted as a guardian figure, then to a big brother, and now back to a little brother. This sense of little brother I think is shown super clearly in the way that essentially I think he's being visually exaggerated as being small. Yeah, he's a small guy and he's short, but on stage, on the bike, and next to Uvo, his size is really exaggerated. And I think it's supposed to emphasize this idea of him being in a little brother situation right now, or in the dynamic. It's also supposed to emphasize how young he is. It's supposed to show how much is on his shoulders at such a young age. It's supposed to show the burden of taking responsibility for what's happened to Sarasa, the burden of leading everyone, and the burden of what's to come. I also think on the other hand, Uvo's role as a big brother or maybe even a parental figure is being emphasized in this as well. Whether it's big brother or guardian, I think he's taken on the responsibility to give reassurance, to give some feeling of security and hope to Chrollo, who's in such a painful spot right now. Everyone starts looking throughout Meteor City, but then Chrollo and Uvo come across Sarasa's locket, and Chrollo says that she might be in the forest. However, Chrollo for sure, but also probably Uvo, they notice tire tracks on the ground. And at this moment, I believe Chrollo knew what they were gonna find. And besides it looking like Uvo was also looking at the tire marks, his reaction tells the same thing that Chrollo's did. That Uvo also knows that the worst outcome has probably happened to Sarasa. And I just wish we could have just this one scene animated, because there is so much emotion, and it really got me emotional. And I just hate that I can't do justice to what this scene tells emotionally. However, let's get into it. We see rain falling, and then just a destroyed, helpless Chrollo. You can tell by the lack of tears and white in his eyes that he's just in a state of shock at what he's looking at. He sees a sack hanging from a tree and the spiders walk to it into the woods. Just the art alone is so beautiful. Beautiful in terms of Togashi's talent. What it actually displays is something terrifying, sad, and depressing. And when I first read this, just the way the art made me feel, I knew exactly what was in that bag. A note written in a different language was left on the tree. Uvo is in disbelief and says someone needs to check what's inside. Paku is in tears and Sheila attempts to comfort her to some degree, and Chrollo says he'll do it. He'll look what's inside the bag. As Chrollo stands below the bag, Uvo asks, "What the hell did they write on that paper?" And all Chrollo can respond with is to ask Uvo to lower the bag. Uvo gets frustrated and asks Chrollo once again, what did the note say? Chrollo refuses to say it again, and just by hearing Chrollo, Uvo knows that now is not the time to ask. He gets up on the tree and cuts the bag down, and Chrollo catches it. Chrollo sits on the ground in the rain and in the darkness and opens it while everyone waits. But right before opening the bag, Uvo drops down to also see what's in there. Chrollo slowly opens the bag and sees Sarasa's dead body not only beaten but twisted up and stuffed into the bag. Any kindness, joyful hope, all of Chrollo's dreams and aspirations all left his body. And you can see this in his eyes. You can also see and feel the emotion he feels. Once again, Togashi's artwork may appear simple in ways, but it tells so much. He doesn't need any complicated shading or hyper-detailed art to deliver the emotion he wants. Chrollo opens the bag a little further and sees a note with a nail pinned through it into Sarasa's head. Uvo stands behind Chrollo, unable to say anything because all he can do is look. The other spiders know that it must be Sarasa, but they're all in a state of shock and some denial. Uvo then demands Chrollo to tell him what the letter said, but Chrollo refuses. Flooded by grief and rage, Uvo grabs Chrollo and screams at him. He screams at Chrollo to tell him what the men who brutally killed Sarasa said. Chrollo pauses for a moment, but says once again he won't say what the letter says. He goes on to say, "I'll take those words to my grave." Chrollo then tells Uvo that if he really wants to know what the letter said, read it himself. Uvo knows that Chrollo knows that he's the only one who can read the language. So out of rage, Uvo throws Chrollo to the side. Uvo storms off. But Shalnar calls out to him, and Machi holds the bag, hugging it, and asks if Uvo is really gonna leave Sarasa's body. Uvo stops in his tracks. Machi says that they need to hurry up and take Sarasa home. She says it would be too sad to leave her, and that her death must have been so painful. Uvo says that she must have been so scared, and then all of the spiders break down and start crying. And then the scene ends with one last picture of the rain. Whew! Alright. So with that scene out of the way, I can go back to talking like normal. I normally don't like to get that serious, but that scene was just so intense and important that I didn't want to ruin it with, cracking jokes or not sounding serious. There honestly isn't too much I want to say about that scene. I think most of what's to be taken away from it is what's right in front of you. I think that this heartbreaking scene conveys so much emotion, and there's nothing I can do to make you feel that. I just really hope everyone was able to feel just the heaviness and the weight of sadness of Sarasa's death. And especially with this death, with all of the emotions and feelings we saw, this is pretty much the prime example of what I'm talking about. This is what humanizes the spiders. Not Pakunoda's sacrifice, not Uvagin's death, none of that. It is this right here that humanizes the spiders, that makes you feel for them, that makes you cry for them. And finally, the last thing I want to talk about here is Togashi's art. I've said a few times that Togashi can use a semi-simplistic art style to convey so much, but it's not like that's his only skill. Togashi has an incredible range of illustrative talents, and I could probably make a whole video about it. However, what I really want to focus in on for this scene is looking into when Togashi gives us hyper-detailed art and when he gives us something I've just been calling simple. Although the events happened one right after the other, the way we go from Chrollo and Uvo looking for Sarasa, and then when they find her, just through the art, we're very easily led into the emotional state Togashi wants us to be in or feel. To explain further, rain begins to fall right as Chrollo finds Sarasa's locket and sees the tire tracks. And at this point, Chrollo realizes that the worst case scenario has likely happened. The rain represents the sadness and emotion Chrollo and likely Uvo feels, but we're shown the rain, and not so much an exact facial expression from them, because this feeling of sadness among other negative emotions are represented by the rain. It also shows how they're trying to keep those emotions away, trying to keep some level of hope, or much more likely just stay strong and not break down, keeping a strong face for the others to some extent. We then get another shot of rain, and just like the first time, it's almost like a bridge into the next stage of emotion. After that, we then get a shot of Chrollo where there's no background, and it's not needed. There's no hyper detailed art needed either, because Togashi only needs the eyes to convey all of the emotion he wants. With Chrollo's white eyes and visible trauma, like I said while going over it, Chrollo already knew that the worst had happened, but actually seeing it, of course it crushed him. But by making his eyes white, not only does it show how destroyed he is emotionally, it quite literally shows and represents him losing everything. Whether that be hope, joy, friendship, happiness, or sanity, Chrollo has lost it. We then get a series of panels of the spiders in the woods along with the opening of the bag Sarasa was in. There's honestly something to take away from each of these drawings, but for the sake of time, the most important thing is the tone in all of these drawings. Right after we see essentially anything good leave Chrollo, we're then essentially thrown into a world of darkness. The world of darkness that Chrollo and the other spiders now live in. The lack of light and plant growth all make it very clear this is a dead and scary or just overall not positive space. Although being in the woods was just part of the plot, the woods, especially the dark and rainy woods, just has a scary or once again, negative connotation. By using the dark and scary woods as the surrounding for everything that happens, the background alone begins to convey a lot of emotion. Then you add the size of the characters to their surroundings, everyone looking so small compared to the giant trees. All of this emphasizes the fact that they're all just young children, but once again adds to the feeling of this place being negative, whether that be just sad, scary, or depressing. But potentially, most importantly, what this display of the woods does is quite literally, artistically represent the world Chrollo was either thrown or born into. I like the term born into because with how much of a dramatic change Chrollo goes through in just this moment, to me it was like he was reborn, but that's kind of besides the point. As we'll see much more of later, Chrollo lost anything good he had, and while the background shows and gives so much, it also represents this very dark and dreadful world Chrollo now lives in. And I think that Togashi is one of the best when it comes to only using as much as you need. He can create the most glorious detailed drawings, but he can also have art that probably has some people saying I could do that. But even then, the amount of talent put behind something that seems so simple is immense. Very last thing to cover about this scene of them finding Sarasa, the rain also does one last thing. In art, anime, manga, and American movies and TVs, rain allows to represent crying. So when it's pouring rain on all of these kids, it shows just how much they're crying, even if they're in too much shock to actually do so. And when we finally see some of them break down and cry, the actual crying on top of the rain shows just so much emotion. In super simple terms, the rain on top of the actual crying multiplies the emotion. Overall, this was the most emotional scene I've read in anything in a while. It's been a good bit since I had my heart really drop and just be overwhelmed with emotion and sadness. I also think that although we've been creeping up on the humanization of the spiders, I think this is the official moment where I believe they've been humanized. And I'm not sure if ironic is the right word, but it's almost ironic that seeing the events that humanize the spiders are the exact events that caused them to become why we thought of them as monsters to begin with. So it's the next day and the spiders are having a funeral for Sarasa. They mention how her body looks so good and it's almost like she's still alive. The preacher goes on to say that the process is called embalming, and that's what makes the corpse look almost alive. He then says to thank a woman named Renko. He also says the restoration of Sarasa's body was nothing short of a miracle. Machi looks at Renko, who stands in the background as the rest of the spiders pay their respects and say their goodbyes. Out of the many emotional moments I felt in this chapter, one that really got to me was how sweet, pure, and just honest Uvo is as he kisses the videotape and lays it in the coffin with Sarasa and says she can keep it. We then see Machi go up to Renko and she tells her that she wants to learn how to embalm like she can. Renko says it's impossible, that it's not something she can teach because it's her own ability. Machi then asks if that ability has something to do with the glow around Renko's body. Renko is surprised and asks if she can really see her aura. And I want to make this point here, and I'll do so quickly. So we know for certain Machi has awakened Nen, very, very likely because of the traumatic event she just went through. And because of this, I think it's likely that the rest of the spiders also awakened Nen at this moment, but we don't know for sure, but I did want to point that out. Oh, and I've almost forgot this very important thing. Assuming all of the spiders did awaken Nen at this moment, such a traumatic, intense awakening of Nen likely not only speaks to their potential, but also explains why a lot of these core members are so powerful. But moving on, Renko gets down on Machi's level and looks into her eyes. She then says, "Those pretty eyes of yours makes my skin crawl." Renko then tosses her some kind of bookmark looking thing. I know there's a word for it, but I'm blanking. But she tosses it to Machi and says if she gets permission from her guardians, she's welcome to come visit her, presumably to be taught Nen, although to Machi, she hears it as, if you want to know what aura and my powers are, come visit. Before moving on, I just got a few things to say. First thing is I don't have the worst feeling about Renko, but I just didn't like her comment about Machi's eyes. As of now, I can't think of a reason why she would or have to do something bad. I just think that she doesn't have a positive presence and won't have one in the spiders' lives. And once again, we only know for sure Machi awakened Nen, but I feel like it's likely the others did too. Chrollo and Uvo are walking through a little graveyard and having a conversation. And I'll be honest, bits of this confused me, so if you had a different understanding, let me know in the comments, but here we go. Chrollo asks Uvo to wait 3 years. He says by the time he's 14, he'll have everything sorted out. And he says he'll have a proper system for Meteor City as well as power of his own. Uvo says he's not waiting and he's gonna leave immediately to find Sarasa's killer. And I really want to point out that right here, Chrollo is talking like our present Chrollo. Very little emotion, but speaking intelligently and precisely. Chrollo then says that going now is pointless. And to persuade Uvo to stay, Chrollo says, "Didn't you promise to travel the world with me?" Uvo gets mad once again and says waiting 3 years won't change anything, but Chrollo says firmly that it will. And from Uvo's reaction, this just shows that Chrollo is talking different. And that different way is how we're used to Chrollo speaking, the way our present Chrollo speaks, planning thoroughly and intelligently. Chrollo then says that they're on the cusp of a communications revolution. Chrollo basically says soon the world will be connected by the internet, essentially. Anyone, anywhere can share information with one another. Uvo asks, what does that matter? And Chrollo explains that the scene where they found Sarasa, it was orchestrated to convey a message. He never says what that message is, but I do have a strong feeling that message was told by the letter Chrollo refused to repeat. Anyway, Chrollo also explains that the killers likely recorded themselves killing and likely torturing Sarasa. He then says, if these people heard of a way to showcase their art to the world, there's no way they could resist. He also has a line I thought was really good and important, although the exact importance I haven't thought about too much. But Chrollo says, evil always lurks in the darkness. It's a simple line, but I felt like it had importance somehow. But moving on. Chrollo then explains that there are rules and regulations that would keep the killers from sharing their video. Because of that, Chrollo plans to turn Meteor City into essentially a safe haven for criminals to pass through. So the goal here is to make it a safe haven so then Sarasa's killers will come to Meteor City in order to share their twisted art. And then that way the spiders can find them. All of the spiders agree to Chrollo's plan and they agree to join him. And right here, I think we get an almost polar opposite to when they were in the woods finding Sarasa's body. Here, of course, some of them are small because, well, they're short, but overall the trees appear much smaller and less intimidating. There's bushes and grass. The sun is shining bright on the spiders, showing their unity and determination and semi-positive outlook on their ability to find Sarasa's killers. However, there's still a lot of darkness and just visual clues that stop this from conveying a 100% positive moment. The inclusion of darkness and roughness in this moment shows that even though the spiders are joined together, even though that they've bonded together and they're prepared, they're bonded by something dark. They're bonded by pain, rage, and sadness. There's a lot of positive and negative things here, once again showing off Togashi's talent. However, among all of this unity, Sheila is shown walking away. Not only walking away, but quite literally walking away from the light and into the darkness of the woods. And wow. This may seem simple, but this has a lot of possible, connotations, but I'll get to that in a little bit. Chrollo says to the group, minus Sheila, that there's something super important in order to ensure what happened to Sarasa never happens again. We get a look at a very dark tree, however it's surrounded by sunlight. And I don't want to dive too deep into this one part, but I feel like the tree represents Chrollo or just the spiders as a whole, a very dark object, and the sunlight shining on that tree basically represents that although the spiders are bonded by darkness, although that their intentions are born out of darkness, the intention almost, is positive, if that makes sense. There's also another way you could take this in. You could essentially see it as the spiders are covered by the tree, unable to reach that sunlight, that the spiders are in such a dark place, they're unable to get back that happiness, that joy that they once had. Like I said, I'm not diving into this one thing so much, so I'm kind of uncertain on what I really think it means, so it's up to you. Anyway, consumed by darkness, Chrollo says, after these 3 years, I'll kill many people. Finks and Paku are accepting it, but they're shocked. And Uvo says, Chrollo. Like he almost doesn't want Chrollo to continue. Not because he literally doesn't want Chrollo to keep talking, but it's as if Uvo wishes he could preserve Chrollo's innocence, yet he does nothing because he knows Chrollo, along with the rest of them, have lost their innocence. Chrollo says, Sarasa wouldn't want that. So if I ever see her again someday somewhere, I'll beg for forgiveness. However, I will not forgive those killers for as long as I live. Once again, this is just a thing that I can't really break down as to why it's such an emotional line. I just have to hope you could feel it when you read it. But when I read this, all I could think was, wow, among just the feeling of pain and suffering and rage Chrollo must feel. Chrollo goes on to say that given the world's legal system, he doesn't think the criminals responsible could ever repent for what they did. So Chrollo says, I'll live the rest of my life as a villain, who will make the whole world tremble with fear. Those thugs won't come near Meteor City ever again once I'm done with this place. Chrollo then asks Uvo will he join him and be the leader of the troupe, but Uvo rejects the offer and says that Chrollo is the leader, and says with Chrollo as the head, he'll follow him until he dies. The spiders all show their agreement and support, and we see Chrollo holding back tears, and then what I assume is a 3-year time skip to all of the spiders meeting in Meteor City, and the chapter ends. I will be talking about Sheila in a moment because she is not here in the time skip. However, before that, super quick, I'd like to point out that this basically confirms Uvagin is black. Some people already thought he was, but now you got more proof of it. And if you have any feeling of commenting that Uvagin isn't black, or if you want to say that anyone can have an afro because anime, manga, blah blah blah, you got the wrong guy and you got the wrong channel. I won't be hearing it. Anywho, something I really want to point out is that this is 99.99% the era of the troupe Nobunaga was talking about, being mindless killers and saying they were just like the Hylia. I say it's likely the era because we haven't seen them do anything, but like narratively, it makes sense that this is the era Nobunaga was talking about. Also, when we get the time skip close-up of Chrollo, the first thing that went through my head was, that looks familiar. Visually, with the hair and the outfit, it's very similar to how we first see Hisoka on the Black Whale. Now, it could just be a coincidence. However, I took it as a teeny tiny parallel or just comparison. I think that Chrollo being shown in what we should assume is a mindset of rage, violence, and efficiency, I think that's exactly how Hisoka is. I think that just like Chrollo was in his most brutal mindset, Hisoka is as well. And I'm not saying Chrollo isn't also in that mindset on the Black Whale, but I saw this as a cool comparison. Now on to Sheila. So we now know for a pretty good certainty that Sheila did not stay to be part of the Phantom Troupe, which leads to one big thought. And this thought majorly goes against the Sheila Periston theory, which I love, but here's a thought I have. So Sheila has been on her own. She's trying to become a hunter, and she comes across the Kurta village. She ends up leaving and is later on killed or found dead or presumed so. So what if the troupe found out about her death and go back to take revenge? Because as Chrollo said, he never wanted what happened to Sarasa to happen to anyone else. So what if after hearing about the stories of the Kurta, they track down where and how Sheila was killed, and they come to the conclusion that the Kurta killed her? That would explain why they killed the Kurta so brutally. There could be some stuff in between. Maybe they're like, who killed her? And someone, could be Sarainek, could be the church, who really knows, but someone could have nudged them to think it's the Kurta. But I think something along those lines might or will soon happen. However, that's just a rough thought. There's so many pieces we don't know to the puzzle of why and how the Kurta were slaughtered, but I wanted to mention it. But I do think we'll soon be leading up to seeing the spiders kill the Kurta, because I do think that with all these parallels we've gotten in this flashback to Kurapika's backstory, especially the part of how a note was left at the Kurta massacre and a note was left at Sarasa's death, amongst many other similarities. But my point is, I think it would make a lot of sense to make the relationship between the spiders and Kurapika essentially come full circle. But once again, there are so many pieces of the puzzle missing, so I really encourage you to think about it yourself and share your thoughts in the comments. Also, as of now, I've lost most of my feelings of not trusting the church and the elders. I think that although they did seem fishy at first, with everything else going on, the church has lost my interest in terms of thinking they're up to no good. Although I thought it would make sense for the church to be involved in the spider's spiral of darkness, they haven't been so far. And if anything, Chrollo himself will deconstruct the church and the elders to make Meteor City the way he wants. And while on that, holy shit, Chrollo was 11 years old and was confident and serious in his ability to kill others, gain power to do so, and completely reshape Meteor City. It's also just heartbreaking, all of the trauma this 11-year-old kid went through, and once again, it's heartbreaking. Now, onto something that may come out of nowhere for some of you, but yeah, so Chrollo reshaping Meteor City in a way making it his, or his kingdom, and his promise to protect the people there creates a really big and sticky situation. However, unfortunately, as of now, I don't see how or when this will ever evolved into anything. But yeah, Gyro spices some things up. This opens up a sticky can of worms, so I'm gonna just be short with this. If Meteor City is in a way Chrollo City, and the people are his to protect, then Gyro, a character stated to be the most evil and determined, and through that implied to be a top-tier character in terms of at least Nen potential, in our current timeline, Gyro is likely in Meteor City as we speak, working on creating his new kingdom. This almost feels like preparation for a whole arc of the spiders fighting Gyro. And on top of that, we get a statement that Gyro and Gon are destined to meet. So in a way, it's almost like an arc with the spiders, Gyro and Gon, plus likely Killua is getting set up. And oh my god, does this idea seem interesting? Gyro creating a kingdom, harming the people of Meteor City, Chrollo coming back to protect his people and his kingdom. It's a wild potential of a story. But with the current state of the story, this is really not something anyone should look forward to, unless out of nowhere Togashi comes back full time or gets someone to take over the art. All that is very unlikely, but I had to mention it. Last thing to go over before I go on about how good this chapter was. Like I said in the first half of the video, the dynamics of the spiders are very fluid. They're all family, but whether characters fit a role of brother, sister, child, or parent, it's all interchangeable. However, here's how I personally feel the current dynamic is. And current as in this time skip. I'd have to give more thought to the current timeline Troupe. But as the leader of the Troupe, I think on an emotional side, Chrollo is in a role of reassuring others, guiding them, and protecting them. However, it's not as intimate as before, so I feel instead of being in the role of a mother, it's now more like a father. I think that Uvo is very flexible. He's very much like the eldest brother who has the responsibility on his shoulders as if he were a parent, and I'd bunch in the rest of them as Chrollo's children. But it's not that clear cut and simple. Every single Troupe member interacts with each other differently. Pakunoda, in my opinion, constantly stays in the role of a sister to Chrollo, but it's all very fluid. The only two big things are I feel that this young, violent Troupe has Chrollo literally in a leadership role, but also as if he were a guardian, he guides them emotionally and protects them. Uvogin also has a much bigger emotional role in the Spiders than I ever thought, making his death heartbreaking to me now. And overall, I feel that Uvo and Chrollo interchange in a parental/guardian role, while the others interchange between being felt or seen as children or siblings. But once again, it's all interchangeable. And there we have it. That's just about all of the specific thoughts I had. This was, to me, an easy top 10 Hunter x Hunter chapter. I personally put it in my top 5, but you know, stuff like that is all up to personal opinion. But the storytelling, on top of the art and emotion of this chapter, is more than we've gotten in a long time. It far surpassed any chapter in the current arc, in my opinion, and I really think, as a manga reader, I just read one of the best chapters I have in a long time. I thought that these flashbacks would have been done by now. However, although it's possible it's the end, I have the feeling that we'll get more explanation to the actual acts of evil the Troupe committed, and through that, I think there's a solid chance we'll see how and why they slaughtered the Kurta. There was just so much to look at and read into this chapter, and I'll likely revisit this all later. But for now, I feel good with everything I've covered. This was just another amazing chapter, and Togashi just time and time again shows that he's still one of the best writers and artists ever. But I'm a bit biased on that, I won't lie. But that's all I got for you today. I hope you enjoyed this video, and as always, please share your thoughts, ideas, feelings, and theories in the comments.